Now let's look at Part B of the endocrine system, specifics of selected glands. Now these are not all the glands of the endocrine system. These tend to be those that have body-wide functions. Glands that are associated with specific organ systems, such as the urinary system, will be covered when that system is addressed. Let's look now at specific glands. First of all, let's enlarge the underside of the brain where the hypothalamus is located. The hypothalamus is the part that's shown. The anterior pituitary is slightly below the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is illustrated. The thyroid gland is another. The adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla are the last two that we want to emphasize. We have to consider the anatomy of the hypothalamus and pituitary as a single unit. The pituitary gland actually is two apparent glands that extend below the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary develops downward from the embryonic brain. The anterior pituitary develops upward from the hypophyseal or Rathke's pouch in the embryonic mouth. Eventually, the anterior pituitary loses its connection with the embryonic mouth. It fuses with the posterior pituitary. So actually, the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus constitute a single gland, as you will see. Here's a little more detail. This is a schematic view of the relationship of the glands. The arrows represent blood vessels, so hormones are transported in the blood. The hypothalamus is part of both the nervous system and the endocrine system. You might think of it as the black box that runs many of the activities of the body. It contains neurosecretory cells. The posterior pituitary, also called the neurohypophysis, is an extension of the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis, is connected to the hypothalamus by blood vessels. Since the posterior pituitary is part of the hypothalamus, it is not really a separate gland. So, in essence, the two glands are the hypothalamus posterior pituitary is one, and the anterior pituitary is the other. Let's look at the blood flow to the pituitary glands. Blood flows into the anterior pituitary through various arteries. The blood enters the primary capillary plexus in the hypothalamus. A plexus is a network. Capillaries are tiny blood vessels which allow for the exchange of material. Through the hypothalamus hypophyseal portal vein, the blood then travels to the anterior pituitary. There, it flows through another capillary plexus, the secondary capillary plexus in the anterior pituitary. After that, the blood flows through various veins to the target organs. The blood flow of the posterior pituitary, it flows into a capillary plexus through arteries. It then flows from the posterior pituitary through veins to the target organs. There are two types of neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. There are short ones with cell bodies in many different areas of the hypothalamus. The axons secrete hormones into the primary capillaries of the hypothalamus. And then there are the long ones. Cell bodies are in other areas of the hypothalamus, including the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei. Axons secrete hormones into the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is the control center for the endocrine system. It serves also as a major link between the nervous and endocrine systems. Here's a list of the hormones produced and secreted by the hypothalamus posterior pituitary complex. 9 are produced by the hypothalamus. 7 are secreted by the hypothalamus. 2 are secreted from the posterior pituitary. The names and relationships will be explained in the next slides. Let's look more closely at the 9 hormones produced by the hypothalamus. One group are called releasing hormones, RH. Their action is to increase hormone release by target cells in the anterior pituitary. GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone. PRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Also not shown, PRH, prolactin releasing hormone, and GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Another group are the inhibiting hormones. Their role is to inhibit hormone release by target cells in the anterior pituitary. There's PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and somatostatin, or GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Other hormones include ADH, vasopressin, and oxytocin. These will be described at a later time. All of the hormones listed are transported by the blood vessels as pointed out. 7 of these hormones are released into the blood by the short neurosecretory cells, the releasing hormones, and the inhibiting hormones are the examples. 2 hormones are released into the blood in the posterior pituitary from the long neurosecretory cells, ADH and oxytocin, both to be covered at a later time. The stimulus for these hormones is a neural stimulus. 6 hormones are produced and released by the anterior pituitary. They include growth hormone. It'll be covered in detail below. The stimulus for growth hormone release is growth hormone releasing hormone. The target, body tissues in general. As we introduce different hormones and glands, I will mention the stimulus and the target. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, or corticotropin. The stimulus is corticotropin releasing hormone, the CRH. The target is the adrenal cortex. The action is to stimulate hormone release. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, also called thyrotropic hormone or thyrotropin. The stimulus is the thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. The target, obviously, the thyroid gland. The action is to stimulate hormone release by the target. FSH. This will be covered under reproduction, as will LH. Both are gonadotropic hormones. Prolactin is another. This is also involved in reproduction. Here's a little background to help you understand the role of growth hormone. As I mentioned, we'll go into some detail about growth hormone. These are nutrients under normal conditions without increased growth. You can think of this as the default arrangement of metabolism. Proteins are composed of amino acids and used as building material. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and used for energy. Both come from the diet. Fats, on the other hand, may be changed into fatty acid. Some could be used for energy, but most are stored as fats. And of course, fats also come from the diet. When there's an increase in growth, however, there has to be a shift in metabolism. Metabolism shifts to the production of additional proteins for growth. More amino acids are needed to make the proteins. Glucose metabolism shifts from generating energy to producing the additional amino acids, mainly in the liver. To replace the glucose, more fatty acids are used to generate energy. Note the major processes: protein synthesis, transport, mobilization, that is, removal from storage, enzyme action. They all require enzyme action. This is an illustration of the complexity of hormone action. Continuing with growth hormone, the targets of growth hormone are all the tissues of the body, but especially skeleton and skeletal muscle. Control of growth hormone secretion begins with the hypothalamus, as we mentioned. It releases a signal, growth hormone releasing hormone, that acts on its target, the adenohypophysis, that is, the anterior pituitary. It releases another signal, growth hormone, that acts on its target. We'll describe the targets in the next slide. The general function of growth hormone is to increase growth of tissues by increasing cell size and cell division. It requires proteins, of course, made by protein synthesis. It also helps to maintain the size of tissues. This results in a decrease in amino acids in the circulation, an increase in glucose in the circulation, because after all, they're being transformed to the liver for modification, and an increase in fatty acids in the circulation, because these are being transported to tissues in general for energy. To increase growth, these hormones are involved in protein synthesis, membrane transport. They increase amino acids, for example, into the cells to make growing cells, increase glucose transport into liver cells to provide raw material for amino acid synthesis, decrease glucose transport into non-liver cells. The result is an increase in blood glucose, as we mentioned. This is called hyperglycemia. It happens within 30 minutes after administration. It's referred to as the diabetogenic effect. It may overload the pancreatic beta cells sometimes and lead to a form of diabetes mellitus. Mobilizing fats within several hours after administration occurs to supply energy. This requires membrane transport, enzyme action. Many of the metabolic reactions are involved, as we mentioned. An increase in cell division occurs. So you see, hormones don't act on just one thing. They act on a great many different processes, all aimed to promote one thing, growth. Growth hormone usually works through hormones called somatomedins, insulin-like growth factors. Let's look at some abnormalities. Excess growth hormone in a child will produce a giant. In an adult, it causes a condition called acromegaly. In this condition, the bones of the face and the hands continue to grow thicker, and it gives the person a bit of a grotesque look. Movie makers have used this to create monsters in monster films. The deficiency of growth hormone in a child leads to a midget, pituitary dwarf. In an adult, it has essentially no effect, but because a defect in growth hormone from the pituitary indicates there may be defects in other pituitary cells, symptoms may then become very complex. Let's look at another gland, the thyroid gland. This gland is located in the throat. It has two lobes connected by an isthmus or a connector. It has a rich blood supply by superior and inferior thyroid arteries. It's filled with sacs called follicles. These are lined by simple cuboidal epithelial cells. The hormones produced and secreted are calcitonin and thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones, and we'll refer to them as TH, contain iodine and include 10% T3, that's triiodothyronine, and 90% thyroxine, T4, tetraiodothyronine. Calcitonin promotes the uptake of calcium by bones and will be covered under the excretory system and was covered to an extent when we discussed the skeleton. What does the stimulus TSH, that is thyroid stimulating hormone, do to the thyroid gland? It increases thyroglobulin synthesis. That's a protein we'll come to in a moment. It increases iodine concentration by increasing the transport of iodine into the thyroid gland. It increases the release of T3 and T4, and it increases the thyroid cell size and number. So as a result, the thyroid gland grows bigger. The targets of TH, and we'll refer to the TH as the T3 and T4 together, are tissues in general. The action of the targets is to increase metabolism. So thyroid hormones are metabolic hormones. It increases carbohydrate and lipid breakdown to generate energy. They increase the size and number of mitochondria. They increase cellular respiration, leading to increased oxygen consumption and heat production. Increased metabolism leads to increased growth in children, increased nervous system function, and it's controlled by negative feedback mainly. An increase in thyroid hormone results in a decrease in TRH release from the hypothalamus. Let's look at the synthesis of thyroid hormone. Let's enlarge the wall of the follicle. Iodine is concentrated in the follicle of the thyroid gland. This is called iodine trapping. Iodine binds to tyrosine, that's an amino acid, in the protein thyroglobulin at one site or two sites. Two of the tyrosines join to form T3 or T4. They're still part of the thyroglobulin protein. Thyroglobulin is taken up by the thyroid cells. The T3 and T4 are split from the thyroglobulin and released into the blood. The thyroglobulin is then recycled to be used again. To increase production of TH, the thyroid gland produces more follicles and more thyroglobulin, as we mentioned earlier. The gland enlarges. What about the relationship of the glands involved in control? Well, this gets a bit complex. A decrease in metabolism may be sensed by the hypothalamus to increase hypothalamic activity. The increase in hypothalamic activity increases the secretion of TRH. That increases anterior pituitary activity, increase the secretion of TSH. That in turn increases thyroid gland activity to increase the secretion of TH to restore the metabolism level back to normal. If the hypothalamic activity is decreased, of course, the opposite would occur. The opposite condition is shown in parentheses. However, control of TH release is largely by negative feedback. The purpose is to maintain stable levels of TH secretion by the thyroid gland. Now let's see if we can figure this out. The cells that produce TRH in the hypothalamus have receptors for TH. TH decreases the activities of these cells. So what would an increase in circulating TH do to the activity of the hypothalamus to maintain homeostasis? The increase in TH would decrease the activity of the hypothalamus. This leads to a decrease in each of the subsequent steps. The result is a decrease in thyroid hormone release, restoring TH levels back to normal. Other control loops also exist. For example, a loop by TSH to the hypothalamus. What would a decrease in the circulating TH do to the activity of the hypothalamus in order to maintain homeostasis? It would increase hypothalamic activity, which would lead to an increase in TSH release. This causes the thyroid gland to enlarge. It releases TH, restoring TH levels back to normal. So an initial decrease in TH leads to an increase in the size of the thyroid gland. A lack of iodine in the diet results in defective TH. Because it's defective, it acts like a deficiency of TH. The hypothalamus fails to respond to the defective TH, and so it thinks it's not getting enough. The hypothalamus increases its activity, causing an increase in TH secretion, leading to an increase in the size of the thyroid gland. The larger gland produces more of the defective TH, and the cycle continues. The result is goiter, an enlargement of the thyroid due to a deficiency of dietary iodine. Other abnormalities of thyroid function may be due to excess TH. This is hyperthyroidism. These abnormalities include such things as intolerance to heat, weakness, decreased sleep, increased heart rate, and some of the others that are listed. A deficiency of TH, hypothyroidism, leads to such conditions as a decreased appetite, abnormal nervous system development, and intolerance to cold. The consequence of deficiency of TH in a fetus or a young baby is called cretinism, minimal to severe mental retardation. Defective development results in dwarfs. In a child, juvenile hypothyroidism the child is clinically normal, but the child may exhibit fatigue and an inability to concentrate. In an adult, the condition is called myxedema. It involves mental apathy, drowsiness, and puffiness of the face and hands. And of course, goiter can result from a deficiency of TH. Let's look at the adrenal glands. Remember, these are two different glands. Regarding the anatomy, the adrenal gland, as I just mentioned, is actually two glands. The entire organ is covered by a capsule. The adrenal medulla is the innermost gland, and the adrenal cortex is the outer gland. It contains three layers: the zona glomerulosa, the outermost layer, the zona fasciculata, the middle layer, and the zona reticularis, the innermost layer. Let's look at the adrenal medulla. The stimulus is the sympathetic nervous system. Hormones include epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are popularly called adrenalin and noradrenaline. The targets are various tissues that are involved in coping with stress. The action is to cope with the stress. We'll describe that under general function shortly. The adrenal cortex, on the other hand, is stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Hormones fall into three groups. They're all steroids, and they're produced from cholesterol. They include mineralocorticoids, 90% of which are aldosterone. They're produced by the zona glomerulosa, and we'll cover them under the kidney. Male sex hormones produced by the zona reticularis. We'll cover these under reproduction. And the third group are the glucocorticoids, 90% of which consist of cortisol. They're produced by the zona fasciculata. The targets of the glucocorticoids are tissues in general. The action is to cope with stress. Let's look at stress. The general function of the medulla is to maintain homeostasis in response to changes in the internal and external environment. Such changes are referred to as stress, anything that's a little different from the normal. On the other hand, the general function of the cortex is to maintain homeostasis in response to changes in the internal and external environment, stress. Aha, have I made a mistake? They both sound the same. Well, even though it sounds the same and both glands are involved in maintaining homeostasis, the adrenal medulla is more involved in initiating the response to stress. It tends to act quickly. The adrenal cortex, on the other hand, modulates the response to stress. It acts a little slower. The general adaptation syndrome is a collective phrase describing the response to stress. Stress can result from many different changes in the internal and external environment, such as physical trauma, prolonged heavy exercise, infection, shock, decreased oxygen supply, pain, fright, emotional stress, prolonged exposure to cold. There are two stages of stress, the alarm stage and the resistance stage. Let's look at an overview of control. Looking at the adrenal medulla first, it begins with the hypothalamus. Neural output of the hypothalamus is the sympathetic nervous system. The system provides input to the adrenal medulla, which then secretes epinephrine, another name for adrenalin. The sympathetic nervous system also releases the neurotransmitter norepinephrine at its targets, and both target various tissues. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are similar and have a comparable function. Thus, one is a backup for the other. How about the adrenal cortex? Again, we begin with the hypothalamus. It releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH. The CRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. The ACTH acts on its target, the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex releases cortisol as well as other glucocorticoids. The cortisol acts on various target tissues. What about the alarm stage? Well, as we mentioned, it's mediated by the adrenal medulla and the sympathetic nervous system. Note that epinephrine and norepinephrine have similar functions. They both act on the target tissues. The general functions are fight or flight, that is, increased activity for running away or fighting. This involves an increase in blood pressure, an increase in the rate and force of the heartbeat, the increased respiratory rate, increased levels of glucose and oxygen is a second general function. This is necessary for the vital organs such as the heart, brain, and skeletal muscles for coping with the stressors. This involves increasing general cell metabolism, increasing glycogenolysis, that is, the breakdown of glycogen to produce glucose, increasing gluconeogenesis in the liver, and increasing mobilization of amino acids. The resistant stage, on the other hand, is mediated more by the adrenal cortex. Its general functions include increasing glucose to supply energy for nervous system function. A major source of such glucose is the liver. Increased amino acids are necessary for repair of possible damage after injury and for gluconeogenesis. Amino acids are made available by decreasing protein synthesis in tissues that are not necessary to cope with the stress. This includes growing tissues, so growth tends to be inhibited, reproductive organs, so reproductive function is often compromised, and the immune system. There's a rapid turnover of protein in the immune system functioning, and so this is a source of amino acids if needed to cope with stress. Extended stress, therefore, often slows growth, interferes with reproductive cycles, and increases illness. Also, some other hormones are involved, like growth hormone. It targets the liver to release insulin-like growth factor to increase lipid and glycogen breakdown. TSH targets the thyroid gland to release TH to increase energy generation. An exhaustion stage may occur if the stress is too severe. This is due to a decrease in immune system function. Pharmacological doses of cortisol are often used to treat injury or illness. They decrease inflammation by decreasing phagocytosis, decreasing vessel permeability, decreasing vasodilation, and decreasing lysosomal rupture. These are characteristics of the immune system, so they'll make more sense when we cover that system. The pharmacological doses also decrease antibody levels, another immune system function, decrease lymphocyte function. Thus, cortisol is useful to reduce the effects of injury or disease. But it also decreases the functioning of the immune system and interferes with healing. COVID, steroids were found to be useful for COVID patients by reducing some of the symptoms such as fluid in the lungs. The drawback is the steroids would slow the healing process. Briefly, a few other glands need mentioning. Parathyroids are attached to the posterior side of the thyroid. We'll cover them under the kidneys. The pancreas functions actually as two glands. It's an exocrine gland secreting digestive enzymes through ducts, and an endocrine gland secreting hormones from pancreatic islets. These include glucagon from the alpha cells and insulin from the beta cells. This will also be covered at a later time. The pineal gland is located in the brain. It secretes a substance called melatonin. This was discovered rather recently, 1959. Its function is not too well understood. It seems to be involved in regulating circadian rhythm. The secretion of melatonin is increased in the dark and decreased in the light. It may have an effect on retarding aging. It does appear to stimulate sleep, and it may coordinate some of the hormones involved in fertility. That's a look at the endocrine system. You're now ready to progress to Unit 15, Reproduction.